The oldest scandal in human memory is not the fruit on the tree or the ark on the mountains. It is the whispered account of a world before the flood, a world that burned bright with genius and sank under the weight of its own pride. The scriptures do not tell it like a myth with carved heroes and trophies. They tell it like a courtroom record. Names, ages, places, lineages. They anchor awe to family trees and altars, to metal and music, to cities and violence. They plant a flag in the ground. This actually happened. Under a sun that still rises. In years you could count on your fingers if you had enough fingers. Start at the beginning that is not a beginning like any other. The earth is formless and empty. The deep is a black mirror. The wind of God moves over waters that do not know where to go. Then light splits the void. Days order the chaos. And the six-step cadence hums like a liturgy. Sky, sea, land, stars, life, majesty. God speaks, and it stands up. And on the seventh day, God rests. That rest is not a nap. It is rule. The Creator sits enthroned, filling creation with His presence like a king settling into a sanctuary. The whole cosmos is presented not as a machine, but as a temple, and the garden planted in Eden is its innermost court. The garden drips with details that later Scripture uses for holy spaces. Gold and onyx glint in a land called Havilah. A river rises to water the garden and becomes 4 headwaters: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, Euphrates. The human is placed there to work it and keep it. The same set of verbs used later for priests guarding and serving in the sanctuary. There is a tree whose fruit gives life, and a tree whose knowledge belongs to God's sovereign wisdom. The imagery refuses to sit still. A garden, a mountain, a temple, a world arranged to host God and man in unbroken friendship. No storm cloud stains the sky yet. The animals move in their kinds. The first pair is formed with intimacy the ancient world never forgot. The man from the ground, the woman from his side. They are naked and not ashamed, and that sentence carries the weight of 1,000 tragedies not yet born. Everything points to peace. Then the first fracture arrives like a whisper. A creature already opposed to the Creator's order speaks with a twist. The woman sees with her eyes and recalculates with desire. The man stands alongside and refuses his priestly task to guard. They take, they eat, and the innocence of the sanctuary evaporates. Shame enters like a cold wind. They hide and sew leaves into coverings that turn to dust before the afternoon is over. Judgment comes not like a lightning bolt, but like a verdict spoken with pain and mercy braided together. The serpent is set under a sentence that sounds like war's opening bell. The ground that fed them will bite back. The woman will bring life forth in a world now resistant. The man will sweat and bleed to coax bread from hostile soil. They are clothed by God with animal skins, a kindness wrapped in a hint of sacrifice. Then they are driven out, eastward, away from the garden. Cherubim with a flashing sword stand at the gate. The way of life is guarded. Access to the holy place is closed. It would be neat to think history shrank when they left the garden. The record insists on the opposite. Outside the sanctuary, life expands fast. The pair begins a family. Worship continues, not with a stone building, but with offerings brought to the Lord. This is old world worship, not a temple of cedar and gold, but a porch of dust and an altar of devotion. An invisible line of return drawn toward the presence that still rules, though unseen. Outside Eden, the next headline stings. 2 sons bring offerings. One brings from the fruit of the ground. The other brings from the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. The Lord regards one and not the other. The text moves with spareness and shock. The older brother rises in the field and kills the younger. The first death of a human is a murder, and the ground which opened to receive Abel's blood becomes a witness against the killer. The Lord places a mark of protection upon the murderer, not to excuse him, but to restrain vengeance. Justice and mercy correct each other so early the ink barely dries. The murderer moves east again and builds. He names his city after his son, Enoch. Urban life begins with a bruised conscience and a new start. The city births culture as fast as spring. A line of names runs like a road. Irad, Mehujael, Methushael, Lamech. A short poem flashes like a knife. Lamech celebrates violence and vengeance double-fold. But then, a different melody rises from the same line. Jabal becomes the father of tent-dwelling herdsmen. Jubal becomes the father of those who handle the lyre and pipe. Tubal-Cain forges bronze and iron. Sheep belts jingle. Lyres and flutes practice scales. Forges roar at twilight. Human hands bearing God's image and now bent under sin's drag innovate without pausing to ask the cost. Metal, music, and migration form a civilization strong and volatile. On the other side of the family tree, another story forms. Adam knows his wife again and names a son Seth, appointed, because, as the text states, God appointed another offspring in place of Abel. Seth's line murmurs a different legacy. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. The phrase lands like a lamp rekindled. Where one line writes songs of iron and swagger, another rekindles the habit of prayer. The Bible refuses to caricature. It grants that the city crafts culture, that agriculture and art bloom. And still it insists a remnant clings to the invisible king. The genealogy of Seth in Genesis 5 reads like a funeral march that somehow rings with hope. 10 names link creation to catastrophe, but with details that keep breathing. Adam lives 930 years. Seth lives 912. Enosh 905. Kenan 910. Mahalalel 895. Jared 962. Enoch 365. Less than the rest, but with a note that stops the reader cold. Enoch walks with God, and the text breaks its own rhythm to say, he is not, for God takes him. Methuselah stretches time to 969, the longest life recorded. Lamech in this line lives 777, a number that sounds like fullness reversed from the violence brag of the other Lamech. And then the line lands on a name that will anchor judgment and rescue at once. Noah. His father says this one will bring relief from the ground Yahweh has cursed. The old world exhales on that sentence. These numbers ignite debates inside candlelit rooms. Different textual traditions preserve different totals. The Masoretic text's chain, from Adam to the flood, counts 1,656 years. The Septuagint's Greek numbers run longer, about 2,256. The Samaritan Pentateuch compresses them to around 1,307. The Bible never presses you to memorize a single sum. It encourages you to see the closeness of the eras. Adam could overlap with Lamech, Noah's father, in the Masoretic arrangement. Living memory could flow like a river through generations who bury one another, and keep recalling Eden by the chorus. People try to flatten this story into either poetry or prehistory. The text keeps resisting. It narrates normal things in a world that surpasses ours. Births, marriages, farms, songs, tools. It counts years and names fathers. It ties the rise of cities to crime and the rise of worship to promise. It insists on a long, populated era between Eden and the deluge, centuries upon centuries in which humanity built, sang, sinned, sought God, and spread out in lands that readers can still trace with their finger on a map. The garden's closure does not end sacred space. It relocates it. Imagine altars formed with bare hands, offerings brought not to a statue, but toward a presence known by name. The ground absorbs the ash. Smoke rises. The family names God aloud. No stone temple stands yet, but the pattern of temple life beats inside human hearts like a memory. Guard, serve, offer rest. Eden had rivers and gold and a commission. The world outside has fields, flocks, and a promise that the serpent's head will be crushed, and the line of the woman, against all odds, will keep walking. This world is not quiet. The city named Enoch hums with commerce. Tents dot the hills where pastoralists drive herds. The forge fires roar where Tubal-Cain's apprentices hammer blades and tools. In the night, the first lyres thrum and flutes weep. Human culture moves faster than modern imaginations sometimes grant to the so-called prehistory. Genesis is not vague. It cites specific arts, trades, and family names. It roots metallurgy, pastoralism, and music in a time before the flood. It paints a human world exploding with mind and craft under a sky that still judges. Temples often enter this conversation with a wagging finger from archaeology, because the ancient Near East remembers shrines and ziggurats in cities that ring the lands of the rivers Moses names. Sumer remembers Eridu and Enki's temple rising close to the marshes. Uruk boasts the great Eanna complex. Nippur crowns Enlil's sacred precinct. Stories are told of kings who built before the flood. The Bible takes a surgical approach. It never places a temple structure before Noah. It does something else instead. It takes the temple's core idea, God with us in a protected garden, a place to approach with reverence, and prints it onto Genesis 1:3. Then, outside the garden, it shows altars and offerings rather than stone sanctuaries. Devotion is portable. The sanctuary is memory and promise, rather than masonry and priestly divisions. It is not an accident that later, when the tabernacle and temple are commissioned, their blueprints smell like Eden. Cherubim woven into curtains, a lampstand like a flowering tree, gold and precious stones gleaming, water for washing, the presence dwelling as rest at the center. Extra-biblical material crowds into the frame at this point. Second Temple Jewish texts, like 1 Enoch, pour color into the gray spaces. They present a story where heavenly beings rebel, descend to earth, take wives and teach forbidden arts, metal weaponry, cosmetics, enchantments, astrology. Those writings dramatize what Genesis leaves taut and minimal. Many early Jewish and Christian readers knew these traditions. Some New Testament books nod in that direction, but the core biblical text keeps its focus. Increased wickedness, violent men of renown, the blurring of boundaries God established at creation, and a godly line still calling on the Lord. Then the sentence that jolts every reader steps onto the page like a judge into a room. The sons of God see that the daughters of man are good, and they take. The same verbs from Eden return, see, take, now cast across a social horizon. The text is condensed but explosive. Interpretations arrive in waves, each with arguments anchored to the scriptures themselves. One line reads, sons of God, as heavenly beings, because in other places like Job 1 and 38, that phrase names the divine council, a group of created spirits who stand before God. This reading sees an invasion of the boundary between heaven and earth. The ancient Greek translation uses a word that becomes giants, and the narrative mentions the Nephilim, literally fallen ones, or those who make others fall, mighty men of renown. Early Jewish tradition, preserved in writings like 1 Enoch, and in summaries by historians like Josephus, runs hard in this direction. Angelic rebellion, human corruption by forbidden knowledge, monstrous offspring, a world driven mad by violence. It is graphic, it is memorable, and it shaped a great deal of Jewish and Christian imagination. Another line reads, "Sons of God, as rulers and kings, tyrants who grab women and build harems by force." The phrase can be used to describe kings as sons of the divine, as in Psalm 82's heated courtroom scene over unjust rulers. The emphasis here is on power gone feral, violence institutionalized, the strong preying on the weak as a legal right. A third line reads, "Sons of God as the covenant family, the line of Seth, who abandoned their distinct calling by marrying indiscriminately with those outside the worship of Yahweh, the daughters of men in Cain's cities." The story then becomes one of compromise, the blurring of moral lines, the loss of spiritual identity. The text itself remains spare and judgment-heavy. It announces that God will not let His Spirit abide in man forever. It names a 120-year limit, which readers have taken either as a countdown to the flood or as a new ceiling on human lifespan that gradually takes effect in generations after the water recedes. It repeats that the Nephilim are on the earth in those days, and also afterward, and points at men of name whose renown does not equal righteousness. The ground trembles under a single indictment. The earth is filled with violence. The vocabulary rings like a monologue in a courtroom. Corruption spread. Flesh corrupted its way. Every intention of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. The narrative looks at cities, families, music, and forges, and says the same heartbeat now drums a rhythm of harm. The world before the flood in the Bible is not only a catalogue of horrors, it still holds a candle. In this crowded, violent world, one man stands described with an old family verb, "Noah walks with God." That same phrase warmed the narrative of Enoch. It is a subtle, nuclear complement. Noah is righteous in his generation. He is blameless in his generation. The contrast stares. In a century pulsing with renown, one man's renown is fidelity. The decision of judgment comes wrapped in particularities. God lays out a design, precise and strange. Build an ark of gopher wood. Construct rooms. Cover it inside and out with pitch. Its length, 300 cubits. Its breadth, 50 cubits. Its height, 30. A cubit translates roughly as 18 inches to 2 feet, depending on the forearm measured. But even the smallest standard lands the ark as a massive structure, longer than a modern football field. 3 decks stacked like a floating warehouse. A single door opens in the side. A roof is set to complete it. The math is not mythic flourish. It is measured instruction. The ark is a conditioned space, a protective vessel in a world about to be returned to watery chaos. The call extends into the living world. 2 of every sort of animal, male and female, will come. 7 pairs of clean animals are later distinguished for what will come after the water falls. This anticipates worship again, a remnant's altar steaming in the New World's sunrise. The ark is not a ship of conquest. It is a sanctuary of preservation, a movable refuge that keeps life breathing until the waters do their terrible work and recede on God's timetable. The Hebrew word for ark, teba, occurs only here and in the story of a baby floated among reeds on the Nile. Rescue in a box becomes a biblical theme. The box is coated with pitch. The word for pitch echoes the word for atonement, covering. The shape whispers theology without speeches. The New Testament will later say, Noah prepared the ark by faith, condemning the world and becoming an heir of righteousness. The Old Testament keeps the camera close to the build. It sits by the woodpile, follows the carpentry, watches the hull sweat under the sun. It names the sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth. Noah is 500 when he fathers them. He is 600 when the water rises. These numbers are not throwaway. They put flesh and time on the decisions. This is a long obedience, a lifetime calibrated by a heavenly word. Before the first raindrop, The Bible pauses to let the antediluvian era spread out on the map. Agriculture is not an invention of post-flood migrants. Vineyards, fields, and flocks have histories here. Iron arrives even before waters. The genealogy from Adam to Noah is not 10 names tossed into a mythic river. It's a declaration that history can be counted. In the Masoretic arrangement, when the calendar clicks to the 17th day of the second month of Noah's 600th year, the fountains of the great deep will burst, and the windows of heaven will open. The writer knows the day. A calendar exists. Time is being measured. For more than a century by one reading of the 120 years, or over decades by another, Noah's generation lives with a clock beating above their heads. Legends from neighboring cultures echo. The Sumerian king list narrates 8 antediluvian kings who rule for impossibly long spans, then states with crisp finality that the flood swept over. An Akkadian tale retold in the Epic of Gilgamesh has a survivor building a boat on divine instruction, sealing it with pitch, loading animals, and riding out a world-destroying deluge. The Mesopotamian gods send flood because humans make too much noise. The Bible's God sends it because the violence soaked the world and corruption deformed human hearts. The differences bite hard. In the cuneiform tales, the gods panic, cower, and squabble. In Genesis, the Creator speaks with moral clarity, judges in sorrow, and remembers with covenant fidelity. The similarities sketch a common cultural memory. The differences reveal a view of God and man you can stake your life on. No temples are named before the waters come, but sacred space keeps rising in the narrative like a refrain. Eden is the primal sanctuary. Offerings begin in Adam's family. Enoch walks in intimacy with the God who still draws near. Even the ark, in its 3 decks and 1 door, begins to sound like sanctuary architecture. Later sanctuaries are partitioned into court, holy place, and holy of holies. The ark preserves a people and animals set apart within its 3 bowls, sealed by a single entry. The pitch shines dark like a covering, a literal seal against water, and a symbol of mercy covering what judgment does not swallow. An ancient Hebrew ear catches the resonances and nods. Judgment arrives. Mercy carves out a protected room inside it. Giants keep their grip on imagination, and the text holds its ground without winking. The Nephilim are named once here. Then the report of Israelite spies in Numbers 13 grabs the name, perhaps to dramatize the intimidating Anakim they see in Canaan. The Hebrews who cowered in that report spoke in distortion and fear. The narrative does not certify their exaggerations. The Nephilim in Genesis 6 are tied to days of creeping ruin, to men of name whose fame is poison to a world that forgets justice. Whether they towered in height beyond the norm, like the later Goliath, 6 cubits and a span measurement suggests a kind of formidable stature, matters less in Genesis than the fact that their renown stapled violence to the earth. Genesis uses the simplest word for the problem, Hamas, violence, filling the land like floodwater already. The earth is corrupt before God. That phrase brings the camera to a throne room. Judgment is not a blind force of nature. It is a moral decree flowing from a personal God who sees. The language of grief is not shy. The Lord is grieved to his heart. He announces a clean-out that only leaves what is preserved as mercy. A remnant plan beats inside the decree. The substitution engine you hear at altars begins to hum here. A single family, a safe box coated with covering, clean animals preserved for offerings when dry ground appears. The move is consistent. Mercy prepares its scene even when judgment occupies the headline. Noah receives another clock tick. 7 days. In 7 days the rain will begin. The number rings with creation weeks and with patience. Animals arrive in their kinds. The language is careful with species and sort without sliding into modern classification debates. This is watchfulness, obituary, and rescue plan in one room. Noah obeys. The phrase repeats. Noah obeys. A single sentence weaves itself through days as the hammer falls on the ark's final pegs. The prophets later point back to this as the pattern. Human wickedness grows bold. The world's structures amplify it. God warns and gives time. Human ears prefer the music and the metal. Righteousness looks small. Then the threshold is crossed. And when it is, the door shuts by God's hand. This is not a panic, not a last-second improvisation. It is a moral universe taking a breath and executing judgment with the same measured speech that once said, "Let there be light." The world before the flood is often painted as primitive in the shallow sense. Genesis resists that slur with stubborn detail. People marry, raise children, found cities, invent music, tame herds, heat metal, boast in poems, and pursue renown. Underneath that cultural rise runs a story of sacred memory and forgetfulness. A line calls upon the name of the Lord. Another line boasts of vengeance. Some build altars, some build empires. The phrase, men of name, stares like a stone. Fame in that world carries a cost disregarded by those who crave it. The strong learn how to seize. Men who call themselves sons of God take by force or seduction from the daughters of men. The boundary between heaven and earth, or between king and commoner, or between covenant and apostasy, blurs to gray. The result is never just private immorality. It is a planet soaked with Hamas. Wisdom literature seeded later in Israel can be heard in embryo here. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The generation of the flood adds an unspoken counter-proverb. The renown of the ruthless is the beginning of ruin. When violence becomes the social default, civilization's tools become multipliers for harm. Metal becomes sword. Music becomes soundtrack to arrogance. Urban planning becomes battle plan. The problem is not metal or music or cities. The problem is a heart that refuses to let God be God and neighbor be neighbor. Genesis traces the water back to that crack in the foundation. Even the genealogies sparkle when turned in the light. 10 names from Adam to Noah set against 10 kings in Mesopotamian traditions. Methuselah dies in the year of the flood, if one follows Masoretic numbers, and though the text does not state the cause, readers have long seen a quiet mercy, his name meaning debated, some hearing, his death shall bring, and God letting him live as long as humanly possible before the world is washed. Enoch's 365, the number of days in a solar year, has invited generations to see a man numbered in harmony with creation, snatched into God's presence, rather than held under the earth's curse. Lamech's 777 in Seth's line answers Cain's Lamech's warped 77-fold vengeance with an echo of completeness sanctified rather than violated. Archaeology has turned up tablets and strata talking to each other across millennia. Ziggurats rise where kings claim heaven's gaze. Water lines in floodplains speak of violent inundations. The Hebrew storyteller cares about these, but not as the point. The point is moral gravity. Ancient lists can number reigns in tens of thousands of years, but the Bible numbers fatherhoods and burials, and the quiet heroism of walking with God. Ancient epics can dress gods in envy and pettiness, but Genesis clothes the Creator in holiness, sorrow at human sin, and covenant mercy. In this pre-flood world, temples in the strict sense do not stand in Genesis's paragraphs. Instead, the whole stage is temple-shaped. Eden sets the pattern. The tabernacle and temple echo it later. Family altars stand in for towering sanctuaries. The heavens open to speak when needed. Angels guard boundaries. The divine presence withdraws enough to let rebellion fill the frame, but not so far that mercy cannot cross the room in a single word. The climax builds without noise. The calendar reaches the week mark God gave. The animals are in. The food stores are sealed. The family stands inside. The door is still open, but only for a breath more. No loud speeches roll across the plain in Genesis' telling. A hush gathers. Outside the ark, cities sit smug in the twilight. The forge is cool. The lyres hung on pegs after rehearsals for feasts now scheduled and doomed. Inside the ark, the air is thick with hay and the lowing of beasts that have no language to know what rescue smells like. The narrative then moves with one of its most understated sentences: the Lord shuts him in. The door closes not with a pulley, but with a gesture from the one the whole story has revolved around since light first ignited darkness. Judgment and mercy both involve hands. The door shuts. Corridors inside the ark grow still. Outside, the wind begins to rise with an old chaos's breath. The fountains of the great deep prepare to break. The windows of the heavens ready to open. The world before the flood has reached the far edge of a cliff it has been racing toward for generations. The old world's legacy is not only ruins, it is also a pattern etched into conscience. Culture can ascend and descend at once. Renown can be poison. Calling upon the name of the Lord is not a footnote. It is the pulse of hope. Giants fall. Shrines of hubris drown. A box sealed with covering sails forward with a family who walked with God when the music of their world sang a different song. The rain has not yet fallen in the sentence you are reading, but the sky can already be smelled. Metal cools on anvils that never imagined how cold water feels against iron. Liars go quiet in squares where laughter carries the tremor of fear no one will admit. Tents fold in the hills. Cities lock their gates. Animals shift in their pens and pause, as if they can taste the pressure pushing down from heaven. Noah stands in the near dark under timbers that creak with a world's worth of promise. And the pre-Diluvian age, with its giants and altars, with its cities and violence, with its first songs and first murders, ends with a door, a silence, and a sky about to break.